I will explain you closures with this amazing behind the scenes presentation that I keep creating just to explain some of the hardest and confusing concepts that I find very hard to understand for a beginner. If you do a poll about which are some of the most hardest concepts in JavaScript to understand, then closure will definitely be in top 5. Closure is one of the most misunderstood concept that is related to function. Closure is so difficult to understand, at least it is represented as. So closure is so difficult to understand that many experienced developers don't understand the mechanism behind it, and they fail to draw the analogy of how a parent function which has an anonymous function, even though after executing the parent function, how the anonymous function is still getting the data of the parent function. Now I'm getting bit termy here, so we are going to talk about terminologies in a moment. I will explain you each and everything about closures, but first of all, let's try to understand that why is closure so difficult to understand. See, closure is not at all difficult to understand. The reason you fail to understand closures or any topic is that you fail to draw the analogies, you fail to understand the behind the scenes, you fail to understand that in what context that particular concept is used in. So closure is difficult because again you have never been taught in the most accurate way. However, I believe that with the right explanation, it's actually not that hard, especially when you already understand everything that you learned before in the first JavaScript course, such as execution context, the call stack, and the scope chain. The reason is closure kind of brings all of these concepts together in a beautiful and in a almost magical way. So to understand closure, let me put it in a much broader statement. To understand closure, you must understand what is execution context, what is call stack, and how does scope chain works. Okay, see, I can explain you closure and I will tell you that remember this rule, and you will remember it, you will understand it. But if I ask you that draw the analogy that how closure is actually working, then if you don't understand execution context, call stack, scope chain, variable environment, then you are going to fail to explain me that. Now I do not want you all to remain at a very beginner level. My goal when I started this channel, my goal was to simply create tutorials that just do not talk upper. No, I really want to get underneath of the subject and will explain you each and everything from the deep point of view. So yeah, if you want to understand, there is no question why do you not want to understand. You will have to understand execution context, call stack, scope chain, how variables are created, how does JavaScript engine actually parse the code from top to bottom. So all of these are very essential, so make sure to check out the main course. And when you understand all of that, then understanding closure will relatively be easier for you, because by that time you will already have again a thorough understanding of all these terms that are related to closures. Okay, so yeah, enough talky, let's see what are closures. So yeah, since we are going to talk about oops next, that's why I have written this comment. For now it doesn't make sense, so let me just get rid of this. Okay, so I'm going to define a retirement calculator function which takes retirement age as argument, and then it helps us to find how much time we have left until we get to retire. Now this retirement age will differ from country to country. For India, retirement age is 60. For US it can be 65. For different countries it differs, right? So then we can reuse this function and to calculate how much years we have left until we get to retire, and depending on the retirement age from that particular country. Okay, now inside of this retirement calculator we are going to return an anonymous function which will then calculate our age. So to calculate our age we need to pass it this parameter year of birth. So this is parameter, and the value that we pass these parameters are argument. Again, these are very simple steps. I have already talked about all of these, so this should not be really difficult for you to understand. And so to calculate age, I'm going to create this age variable, and let's assume we are in 2026, and so 2026 minus year of birth. So here we calculated our current age, and now all I have to do is I have to say console.log. Don't worry, this example will make 100% sense. Okay, just hold on. So here I'm just going to say here I just have to say I have to calculate the retirement age, right? So here I will say come on, inside this retirement age minus age. Okay, and let's add one more statement here. I will create a statement equals to years until retirement, and let's concatenate this statement here. So what I'm doing is that I've created a main function called as retirement calculator, that is returning us a function that calculates our age, and it returns us the year that is left for us to do the service. After that we can retire. Now how do we call it? Well, we call it as this. We call it retirement calculator, and then we are going to pass the retirement age. So let's say that in India retirement age is 60. Okay, so here I'm going to pass that retirement age for my country is 60. Okay, so now tell me how much time left for me to retire, how much more I have to be in the service. Now this retirement calculator, okay, what does this retirement calculator returns? Well, it returns a function. So always remember, I have also discussed this in my functions class. So whenever you return something from the function, then this function itself becomes a value, and so when this becomes a value, then you can store this into a variable. So here this entire function, so yes, this function, this retirement calculator function, it indeed is a function, but now this will also be a general value which we can store in a variable, which I can call retirement finder India. I know it is a more descriptive variable name, but let's go with it. Now this retirement finder India is this value, right? Because this is what we are returning from this retirement calculator. So this return function is indeed a value. So this retirement finder India is also going to be a function, because this retirement finder India, what does it holds? Well, it holds the value that this retirement calculator is returning. What does this retirement calculator return? Well, this returns this simple return function, right? So now this function is this variable is actually the function that has this value. So here again I can call this retirement calculator, well, not calculator, but let's just copy it, retirement finder India. This is a very difficult way, I mean not difficult, but sometimes writing these long variable names, it can be little tough to counter. Okay, so copying and pasting it much more easier than letting the code itself suggest us that hey, you want to use this variable. But anyway, so this retirement finder is accepting this year of birth, so I can say that hey, I was born in 1980. However, I was not born in 1980. So let's now draw the analogy of how the code is working. So this retirement finder is getting this value of 1980. So here we are going to get this 1980. In return, we will be passing 1980 here. Okay, so now this will be calculated like this. So 2026 minus 1980, which will be 46. Okay, so 46. So my age is 46. Now to calculate retirement age, what do we need? We need our retirement age. So retirement age is in India, it is 60. So 60 minus 46, which means we have 14 years left until we get to retire. So if I save this, we will get 14 years until retirement. Let's have some space here so that it will look readable. So this is a very simple function that helps us to calculate how much time it is left for us to retire. Now if you want to find the retirement age for US, let's say that in US it is 65 years, then you can retire. Okay, you have to do service for 65 years and then you can retire. So again you can call this retirement calculator. Let's copy this again. Okay, and then here you can pass 65, and now you know that this entire function itself returns a function. Now I know, so no need to store it into a variable. I can do that. I can say retire US, I can call it let's keep it very short, and I can say retire US, and I will pass that this gentleman from US, he was born in 1968. So for someone who was born in 1968, he will have how much time? So okay, so he just have 7 years until they get to retire. But now instead of creating a separate variable, what you can do is that, let me comment this out and let's get rid of this. Now you can call this entire function again. So instead of saving it, you know that this retirement calculator is going to return us a function, so I can call it straight away. And now the value, the argument that I was passing here in the retire US variable, I can pass that here itself, 1968, well 67, which means he or she has 8 years until retirement. So if I save this, 8 years until, oh wow, mathematical miscalculations, oops. Okay, anyway, 6 years until retirement. Okay, so now this is the two ways how you can actually call a function that is returning a function itself. Now this is a very simple example. How do we understand closures with this? So everything that you just saw is a pure example of closures. Now we know that when a function is getting called, when a function gets called, it gets stacked on the execution stack, right? So when I call this retirement calculator, an execution context was created and it was put on the top of the main function, right? And after that, inside that execution context, we have this statement variable, and then we have this function. Don't worry, we are going to see the graph as well, we are going to see the presentation, so we are going to understand everything. Now inside of that function, we are returning something. Now when I call that function, the function gets popped off the stack, right? Which means it is done executing. Now if a function is done executing, which means this entire function is done executing, how does this return function, which we are returning from inside of this function, how does this return function able to access variables from an already executed function? So function is gone long back, we have executed, we have popped that off from the execution stack, but still the inner function is able to get hold of variables from the function that is already executed. So this retirement age, you see this retirement age and this statement, this inner function has access to variables of its outer function, even though the outer function is gone long back. How does this work? Well, this is exactly closures. So now let's draw the analogies by looking at the presentation, and all of this will become crystal clear. So you can summarize closures by saying an inner function has always access to the variables and parameters of its outer function even after the outer function has returned. So let's draw the analogy of what happens when we call our retirement finder function. So we know that a new function gets a new execution context that is put on the top of the execution stack. That execution context has an object which stores the variables, the scope chain, and this variable. So let's see the scope chain of the retirement calculator function, which simply means the variables that the function has access to. And remember that scope chain is like a pointer to all the variable object that the function has access to. Alright, so function has access to the retirement age argument that is set to 60 for India, and statement variable that holds our string. Okay, and then the function returns. So after the function returns, now the execution context of the retirement calculator function is effectively gone, and with it the variable object and the entire scope chain should be gone, right? Actually no. The secret to closures is that even after function returns and execution context is gone, the variable object is still there. It is not gone. It still sits here in memory and it can be accessed, and that is why we still see it there in the execution stack on the top left side, and also in the scope chain in the right side. Because, and I'm sure that you remember this from previous explanations, that the scope chain is in fact a pointer to variable objects, and in this case the variable object that we have here on the stack. So let's see this in action. Let's call the inner function that we effectively called retirement finder India with the argument of 1980, which puts a new execution context on the stack. Let's now look at the scope chain. So since this inner function is written lexically in retirement calculator function, it has access to its scope, and you already know and use that. And here comes the magic. Since the variable object of the retirement calculator function is still there, the scope chain stays intact. It keeps working, and so we can access the variables that were created in the retirement calculator function long after the function has already completed its execution and after its execution context is of course gone. The current execution context has closed in on the outer variable object so that we can use it, and that is why it is called a closure. So the scope chain always stays intact. This is the most important thing that you have to understand and remember. And just to finish this, the function simply returns and the context is popped off the stack as usual. So now you not only know what closures are, but you also know how and why they actually work. And now I want to tell you that always remember that we never create a closure manually. It is not a feature, it's a mechanism of how JavaScript is built. So closure is not a feature, it is just a mechanism that is really built into JavaScript. We don't have to worry about anything. We don't have to say that, hey, we want to create the closure. No, JavaScript will always do this work for us automatically. And now the summary even makes more sense to you. An inner function has always access to the variables and parameters of its outer function even after the outer function has returned. Now any of this, if it is not making sense to you, then it would be because you still have confusion in understanding what is this keyword, what is scope chain, what is execution context. For that, you will have to watch the long JavaScript course, and then you will be able to understand everything that I just put together. So you can never understand closure on its own. You will have to draw the analogies of how closure is working behind the scenes, and this is my main motive of creating these lectures. Alright, so if you liked, do make sure to subscribe. Let's now write few more lines of code and then we will wrap our closure section. And now again, if you want to find how much years left until retirement for other country, you can reuse this function. So just call it, and let's assume that we are finding the retirement age for Iceland. So in Iceland, the retirement age is 67, and if a person who was born in let's keep it 1967, then how much time in 2026, how much time they will have left until they get to retire. So if I save, so they still have 8 years of service left to do. After that they can retire. Okay, so this is a very simple closures example. Okay everyone, so now we are done with the ins and outs of functions. Let's now start object oriented programming with full swag.